The quiet hum of the evening settled in as Daniel and I sat down for dinner. The soft glow of the candlelight flickered between us, casting shadows that only seemed to deepen the silence. I poked at my food, my fork clinking against the plate in the otherwise still room. He had been quiet all evening, which wasn't unusual, but tonight it felt different. The tension in the air was thick, almost palpable. So, I began, breaking the silence, trying to fill the void that seemed to grow between us. I was thinking about something today. Daniel looked up briefly from his plate, his eyes flickering with mild interest before returning to his food. He didn't say anything, which I took as permission to continue. I wasn't sure why I felt the need to say it, but I had been carrying this thought around for weeks. It had been bothering me, gnawing at the back of my mind. I can't recall half of my past flings, I said, almost nonchalantly, as I took a sip of my wine. It was a strange thing to say, I knew that. It wasn't something you typically blurt out over dinner. But for some reason, it felt important to get it off my chest. I wasn't sure if I was looking for a reaction or if I just wanted to see how he would respond. Maybe I was testing the waters, testing him. For a moment, Daniel didn't say anything. He just kept chewing, the tension still lingering between us. I had expected some kind of comment, some sarcastic remark, but he remained silent. I thought I caught a flicker of something in his eyes, something like a flash of discomfort, but it was gone so quickly that I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. I forced a laugh, trying to break the silence. I mean, it's not like they were significant or anything. Just, flings. A few bad decisions here and there. His response was slow, almost deliberate. He set down his fork, and for the first time that evening, he looked directly at me. His gaze wasn't warm or affectionate, it was almost distant. "That's interesting," he muttered, his voice flat. It wasn't the response I had expected. I had thought he would laugh it off, maybe make a joke about it, but instead, he just seemed indifferent. That bothered me more than I cared to admit. The comment that had once seemed like an innocent throwaway now felt heavy. I looked at him, searching his face for some kind of clue, some hint at what he was thinking, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at his plate, his expression unreadable. "Are you okay?" I asked, suddenly unsure of myself. The question felt like a lifeline, something to pull us back from the edge of whatever strange place we had just drifted into. He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was low, almost as if he were speaking to himself rather than to me. "I'm fine," he said. "I just didn't think you would bring that up." I frowned, the unease in my chest growing. "Why not?" "Because it doesn't really matter, does it?" he replied, his eyes still fixed on the food. "Your past is your past. It's not like it has anything to do with now." I could hear the defensiveness in his tone, though he was trying to mask it. It was there, under the surface, like a crack in a foundation that was threatening to split open. "You're right," I said, unsure of what to say next. "It doesn't matter." But as the words left my mouth, I wasn't so sure anymore. The atmosphere in the room had changed. What had started as a casual remark about my past had somehow turned into a conversation about something deeper, something unspoken that neither of us seemed willing to acknowledge. I tried to shake it off, but the unease clung to me, a lingering presence that refused to leave. We finished the meal in silence. I could feel Daniel's distance, even if he wasn't saying it out loud. It wasn't just the words we had exchanged, it was the way his posture had changed, the way he seemed to retreat further into himself with each passing moment. The tension between us had settled into something heavier, something that would be impossible to ignore. Later that night, as we sat on the couch watching a show we had both seen 100 times, I could feel him pulling away even more. It wasn't like the quiet evenings we had spent together before, where the silence was comfortable. This time, it felt strained. Every word he spoke was curt, every glance he cast at me seemed measured, as if he were trying to keep some invisible wall between us. I tried to dismiss it, to convince myself that it was just a phase, that maybe he was tired or stressed. But something inside me told me that it wasn't just about that comment. It was about something deeper. I turned to him, hoping for some sign of the man I married, the man I thought I knew. "Daniel?" I asked softly. "Are we okay?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. I couldn't tell if he didn't hear me or if he was avoiding the question altogether. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were distant, too distant. "We're fine," he said, his voice lacking conviction. He turned back to the TV, the flickering images casting strange shadows across his face. I watched him for a few more seconds, wondering if there was anything left to salvage, anything that could bring us back to where we had been. But in that moment, I realized that I didn't know the answer. And I wasn't sure I ever would. The days after the dinner felt like a slow unraveling. I tried to shake off the awkwardness between Daniel and me, but the more I tried to pretend things were normal, the more they felt off. It wasn't just the silence that hung over us, it was the distance, the emotional space that had opened up between us. Every time I spoke to him, he answered in short, clipped sentences. Every time I reached out, he pulled back. It was like he was a ghost, fading further away from me. I kept telling myself that it was just a phase, that we'd get past it. We always had before. But something in the back of my mind told me that this time was different. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been broken, and I wasn't sure it could be fixed. At night, we would lie in bed, both of us facing the same direction, but it felt like we were miles apart. I could hear his steady breathing, but it didn't comfort me like it used to. Instead, it made the space between us feel even wider. I found myself staring at the ceiling, wondering where things had gone wrong. Was it really just my offhand remark that had caused all this? Or was there something deeper at play? Something I hadn't seen until it was too late. I tried to talk to him the next day, but every time I did, it was like speaking to a wall. His responses were distant, uninterested. He'd nod occasionally, but his eyes never met mine. He seemed to be lost in his own world, and I was standing on the outside, unable to reach him. I found myself wondering if he was just as lost as I felt. It was during one of these silent moments that I decided to reach out to Sophie, my closest friend. I needed to talk to someone, to get some perspective. Maybe I was overthinking things. Maybe I was making a mountain out of a molehill. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. So, I called her, and we arranged to meet at a small cafe downtown. Sophie was always the one I went to for advice, the one who seemed to have all the answers. She was the calm in my storm, the voice of reason when I couldn't make sense of things. I needed her now more than ever. We sat down at a corner table, and I could already tell something was different in the air. Sophie wasn't her usual cheerful self. She seemed distracted, her eyes darting around the room as if she were looking for an escape. I could see that something was weighing on her, but for once, she wasn't the one talking. It was my turn. "I don't know what to do," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Things with Daniel, they've just been so off lately. Ever since I said that thing about my past, he's been pulling away. He's distant. And I don't know why. I've tried everything, but nothing seems to get through to him." Sophie's eyes softened, and she leaned in, her voice quiet but firm. "Lila, I know you don't want to hear this, but I think you need to look at the bigger picture here. Maybe it's not just about your comment. Maybe it's about more than that. I frowned, feeling a lump form in my throat. What do you mean? Sophie hesitated for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. Well, from what I've seen, Daniel's always had his own insecurities. He's never been the most confident guy, and I know that. But maybe your comment triggered something in him, something he's been bottling up for a long time. You know how he's always worried about his place in your life, right? Maybe it's that. Maybe he feels like he's not enough for you. Her words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I had never really thought about it like that before. Daniel had always seemed so self-assured on the surface, but maybe that was just a mask. Maybe underneath it all, he had been carrying doubts about our relationship that I had never noticed. I never thought of it that way, I murmured, staring down at my coffee cup. But now that you mention it, it makes sense. I've always been so focused on myself, on my past. I never really stopped to think about how he might feel. How my past could make him feel like he doesn't measure up. Sophie nodded. It's not just about you, Lila. It's about how your actions affect him. You've got to think about his feelings too. I'm not saying you shouldn't be yourself, but sometimes the things we say, things that seem harmless to us, can hurt the people we love the most. I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. Had I been too careless? Had I been so focused on making light of my past that I had failed to see how it was affecting Daniel? My comment had been flippant, but I never imagined it would cut so deep. Now that Sophie had pointed it out, I could see it. I could feel it. But what do I do now? I asked, feeling lost. How do I fix this? How do I make things right with him? Sophie paused, her eyes thoughtful. You can't just fix it with one conversation, Lila. It's going to take time. But you can start by showing him that you care. That you're willing to put in the effort to understand him. If you really want this to work, you've got to be vulnerable with him. Open up about your own insecurities, your own fears. Show him that you're not perfect, that you're willing to grow together. Her words were like a lifeline, something to hold on to. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but I also knew that I couldn't just sit back and let things fall apart. If I wanted my marriage to survive, I had to do more than just apologize. I had to be there for him in ways I hadn't been before. When I got home that night, Daniel was already on the couch, flipping through channels absent-mindedly. He didn't even look up when I walked in. I could feel the gap between us, the silence that had settled in like a permanent fixture. But this time, I wasn't going to let it stay there. I wasn't going to let it consume us. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I knew had to come next. Daniel, I said, my voice trembling slightly. We need to talk. The moment I said Daniel's name, I knew things were different. The air between us had shifted, and even though he didn't look up immediately, I could feel the weight of his silence pressing down on me. It was as though a wall had gone up between us, and I was standing on one side, trying to reach him, while he remained behind it, far away. But I had to try. I had to say something, anything, to break through the coldness that had wrapped itself around us. Daniel, please, I said, stepping closer to the couch. I didn't know what I expected from him, but I knew that silence would only make things worse. We need to talk about what's going on. He didn't respond right away. His eyes were glued to the TV, as if the images on the screen could somehow distract him from the conversation we both knew was inevitable. The longer he ignored me, the more the frustration built up inside me, but I swallowed it down. I couldn't afford to let my emotions get in the way this time. I know you're upset, I continued, my voice softer now. And I don't blame you. I said something stupid the other night, and I regret it. But it's not just about that, is it? There's something more going on here, something we're not talking about. Finally, he turned his head, but he still wouldn't look at me directly. His gaze was fixed somewhere near my shoulder, distant and unfocused. "I'm not upset," he said quietly, but the flatness in his voice betrayed him. "I just don't think it matters anymore." I felt my chest tighten at his words. "What do you mean, it doesn't matter anymore?" He sighed, a long, weary sound that made my heart ache. "I mean, I don't think we're in the same place anymore, Lila. Things aren't the way they used to be. Maybe they never were." His words hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. I felt the weight of them settle over me, and for the first time in a long while, I wondered if he was right. Had we ever truly been in the same place? Had I ever really seen him, or had I just been too focused on myself, on my own needs and desires, to notice what he was going through? "Daniel, that's not true," I said, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "We've been through so much together. We've made it through hard times before. Don't you remember that? Don't you remember what we've built?" He finally looked at me, his eyes cold and distant, and I could see the exhaustion in them. "Maybe I do," he said quietly. "But I don't know if it's enough anymore. I don't know if I can keep pretending that things are fine when they're not." His words stung, but they were also a wake-up call. I realized then that he wasn't just upset about the comment I had made. He was tired. Tired of pretending, tired of the distance between us, tired of feeling like he wasn't enough. And I had been too blind to see it. "I never meant to make you feel like that," I said, my voice shaking. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "I know you didn't," he replied, his voice softening slightly. "But sometimes, I think you don't see me." "Not really. You talk about your past like it's nothing, like it doesn't matter. But for me, it's always been there. And every time you bring it up, I wonder why I'm even here. Why you're with me." His words were like a dagger, sharp and cutting. They went straight to my heart, and for a moment, I felt like I couldn't breathe. How had I missed this? How had I been so blind to his insecurities, to the way my actions were affecting him? I had been so wrapped up in my own world, in my own struggles, that I hadn't noticed the slow, steady erosion of our relationship. And now, it was too late. Or at least, that's how it felt. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I never realized. I never knew you felt that way." "Because you never asked," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You never asked how I felt. You never stopped to think about how your words might affect me. And now, I don't know how to go back. I don't know if I can." I could feel the tears threatening to spill, but I held them back. I wasn't going to let him see how much his words had shaken me. I wasn't going to let him see how much I was struggling to keep it all together. But inside, I was falling apart. I had taken him for granted, assumed that everything would always be fine, and now I was paying the price for it. "I don't want to lose you, Daniel," I said, my voice cracking. "I don't want this to be the end. I know I've messed up, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make it right. To show you that I care. That you matter to me." He looked at me then, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he was going to say something, to tell me that it was too late, that we were beyond saving. But instead, he just nodded, slowly, as if weighing the words before he spoke. "I don't know if I can trust you again," he said softly. "I don't know if I can ever feel the way I used to." The words stung, but I understood them. I had broken his trust, and it wasn't something that could be fixed overnight. It would take time, if it could be fixed at all. I couldn't undo the damage I had caused, but I could try to make it right. I could try to show him that I was committed to changing, to being the partner he needed, not just the one I had been. "I'm not asking you to trust me right away," I said, my voice steady now. "But I will earn it. I'll do whatever it takes to prove that I'm here, that I'm not going anywhere." He didn't respond, but for the first time in a long time, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was something. A glimmer of the man I had fallen in love with. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start again. We sat there for a long time, the silence hanging between us like a thread waiting to be mended. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't ready to give up on us. Not yet. The days that followed were like walking through a fog, unsure of what direction to take but unable to stop moving forward. Daniel and I didn't have any grand moments of clarity or sudden breakthroughs. Instead, we lived in the slow, awkward space between us, trying to rebuild something that had been shattered by words, by silence, by things left unsaid. I could tell he was still processing, still trying to come to terms with everything. And I was doing the same. I spent a lot of time thinking about what he had said to me that night, the way I had hurt him without even realizing it, how I had never truly seen him, how I had taken him for granted. I had always been so caught up in my own world, my own past, that I never considered how it might make him feel, how it might make him question his place in my life. I could see now that I had made him feel small, insignificant, and it broke my heart. We started to talk more, really talk. Not just about the things we were angry about or upset by, but about the things that we had kept hidden, the insecurities that had been lurking beneath the surface for so long. We shared things with each other that we had never said before, things that we had been afraid to say, or maybe too proud to admit. And while it was painful at times, I think it was also the only way we could move forward. I told him about the things I had never told him, the parts of my past that I had kept locked away for so long. The relationships, the people I had been with, the mistakes I had made. I explained that my offhand remark had come from a place of fear, not malice, that I had been trying to distance myself from the woman I had been, from the decisions I had made, and in doing so, I had hurt him. I had made him feel like he was just another chapter in a story I was trying to forget. I couldn't take back what I had said, but I could try to show him who I was now, who I wanted to be with him. Daniel listened. I could see the pain in his eyes as I spoke, but he didn't interrupt me. He didn't judge me. He just listened, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were in sync. Like we were on the same page, not fighting against each other but fighting together for something better. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt, moments when I wondered if things would ever feel like they used to, when I wondered if we would ever find our way back to each other. But there were also moments of connection, small but significant, that made me believe we could rebuild. We laughed together again, the way we used to, without hesitation. We shared meals, cooked together, and even started talking about things we wanted to do in the future, things that had once seemed impossible to plan. But what surprised me the most was the way Daniel began to open up. For so long, he had kept his insecurities buried deep inside, afraid to show me the parts of himself that he thought weren't enough. But as we began to talk more honestly, he started to share those fears with me. He told me about his own doubts, about how he had always felt like he wasn't good enough for me, how he had always wondered if I was settling for him, if I had ever truly been happy with him. He had never said any of this before, and hearing it felt like a punch to the gut. How could I have been so blind to his pain? But I didn't blame him. I understood now. I understood why he had pulled away, why he had seemed so distant, because he had been living with these feelings of inadequacy, these doubts about our relationship, for far too long. We didn't fix everything overnight. There were still days when we didn't quite know what to say to each other, when the silence between us felt heavy and suffocating. But the difference was that now, we didn't let that silence define us. We didn't let it push us apart. We worked through it, one conversation at a time. And slowly, I began to see the change in him. The guarded look in his eyes started to fade, replaced by something softer, something more vulnerable. He was starting to trust me again. Not fully, not yet, but there was progress. I could see it in the way he looked at me when we spoke, the way his hand brushed against mine when we sat together, the way he started to open up about his own fears, his own hopes for the future. We weren't fixed, not by a long shot. But we were learning how to communicate, how to listen to each other in ways we hadn't before. And in that, I found hope. We weren't perfect, but we were real. We were willing to fight for each other, and that was enough. One night, after a long day of talking and reconnecting, Daniel took my hand in his and looked at me with those familiar eyes, the ones that had always held so much warmth, so much love. But now, there was something else in them. Something new. Something that told me we were moving forward, together. "I don't know where this is going, Lila," he said softly. "I don't know if we can ever go back to how things were, but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to keep trying, if you are." I smiled, feeling a lump form in my throat. I am. I want to try too. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. We didn't have all the answers. We didn't know what the future would hold, or whether we would ever fully heal from the wounds we had inflicted on each other. But we were committed to figuring it out together, to not letting go, no matter how hard it got. We still had a long way to go, but as we sat there, hand in hand, I knew that we were on the right path. And for the first time in a long time, I believed that we might just make it after all.